But we are happy to announce we have Steve Lonegan back with us now. He's actually in our studio. We mentioned he was stuck in traffic, but now he's seated. We see him. And Steve, it's great to see you. I want to continue our discussion now and talk more about your role in the financial world and some stuff that's going on at the Federal Reserve right now. All right, let's start with Janet Yellen. She's been having these closed-door meetings on monetary policy with some left-wing groups. Now, the Fed has been known as being somewhat secretive ever since its inception many years ago, but what makes this any different?
Well, there's been a trend, John, that started back in March, right after Janet Yellen was confirmed by the Senate, where she went out to Chicago and she said she was meeting with working families. She met with 3 gentlemen, working men, unemployed, 2 of whom turned out to be felons. And somehow she thinks that represents working people. She then posed for a press op with a welding mask, which is really, I've never seen Fed chairman doing press events like this. Then she was in Boston in October, where she made a speech where she wandered into the areas of education funding and income redistribution and inheritance taxes, again, political issues, not monetary issues. And then she had a meeting just last week with representatives of the left, the Center for Popular Democracy, a bunch of community organizers with a very liberal agenda.
Mention some of those, talk about some of those groups. Name some names for us, specifically which groups met with
Well, you had the American Working Families Party out of Pennsylvania, which actively engaged in the election for the Democrat governor there. You had the Center for Popular Democracy out of Brooklyn, New York, has a very far-left liberal agenda. And monetary policy, the Federal Reserve chairman and the Federal Reserve, like Caesar's wife, needs to be above reproach. Monetary policy should not be being used to achieve political ends or desired outcomes for special interest groups. It's our money, and nobody should be meddling it, or as Thomas Jefferson would have said, treating it like jugglers. And that's exactly what they're doing. We have requested at American Principles Project that we meet with Madam Yellen as well, with other representatives of center-right coalition, of conservative groups such as the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, and others, who can bring real dynamic thoughts to the table in the same way she did with the left, so she sees the entire spectrum. By the way, on my way here this morning while I was stuck in traffic, I called Madam Yellen's office. They are in receipt of our request, and they are considering, and hopefully we'll be successful at this, and we'll get her to see both points of view.
Well, that would be good, and that was my next question, but I'll move on past that. Your group favors a financial system that's backed by gold. And you say that Democrats would have maintained their majority in Congress during the midterm elections if they had backed a currency system that was backed by gold.
If you look at the history of the American economy, Richard Nixon closed the gold window on October 15th, 1971. John, in the 43 years since Nixon ended the gold standard, our economic growth has averaged 3.5% GDP a year. In the 43 years prior to Nixon ending the gold standard, our GDP growth was 4.5% a year. Had we maintained gold standard growth rates for the past 43 years, our economy would be 50% bigger today. I mean, think about that. Your average paycheck would be 50% greater for the people in the studio. The cost of living would be lower. Inflation has gone through the roof since the ending of the gold standard. We need to return to a rules-based monetary system where special interest groups cannot control our money or have influence into how monetary policy is made. And the only way to do that is to go back to the gold standard.
Well, Steve, besides you and a few other folks, we have not heard quite as much pressure on the Fed as of recently. I'm looking at some economic reports coming out today. All major indices in this country near record highs, growth at 3.9%. Housing on its way back up, all would appear well in the world of finance.
Yeah, the stock market is booming, and the rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is getting squeezed. Middle class working families are experiencing a loss of buying power. They've watched an 8% drop in the median household income over the last 7 years. So we see all these great indices. But go to the average working person who's going into a store today and paying $5 for a gallon of milk, or seeing their paycheck do less and less. Yes, the increased money supply is growing the stock market, but we are seeing a widening income gap. And when President Obama says that, he's right. There is a widening income gap, but it's not free market capitalism that's causing it. It's the monetary policy coming out of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Well, we do hear some whispers coming from inner circles in Washington, D.C., from some conservatives talking about the next campaign and what they're going to talk about. And one of those things that we've heard discussed potentially is raising wages. An interesting idea, not raising the minimum wage, but doing it through a free market kind of system, and I think that would help the GOP gain a lot of those voters that you talked about who feel like they are being squeezed.
Well, I don't know how the government raises wages through a free market system. If the government's raising wages, how's it a free market system? The free market raises wages because
maybe that's getting the government
people become
out
more
of the
productive
regulatory
because
structure.
Well, yeah, of course, that would be a great, but when the government and the Fed is manipulating money in order to redistribute wealth or manipulating monetary policy in order to achieve political outcomes, that becomes very dangerous territory.
Dangerous indeed, and you know, not a lot of folks have confidence still in the stock markets, even though they're near record highs. It all feels like a game to a lot of folks out there. Steve Lonegan, thanks so much for being with us, and thank you for hustling through the traffic to get into our studio so we could see you face to face.
Thank you, John.
All right, Steve Lonegan back with us, and sorry to jump ahead before. We will have a discussion about rock's golden age, talking about a working memoir. We'll have a special author with us right after.